Hello, my name is Devin Jones, and welcome to this edition of the Sparx Tribune Report. You can find me on Twitter at the user handle provided in the description box below, and the Sparx Tribune's website, and I'll provide a link in the description box below to that as well. Today I'd like to break down a video Ben Shapiro did yesterday. As of the recording of this video, his video was yesterday, and he's treading very dangerous waters at this point. He's employing the same logic when Ben Shapiro is pulling the same logic as the conspiracy theorist white genocide crowd at this point. He's gone full-on white genocide, and I'll get to that toward the end of the description of the small piece of literature that he's attempting to expose here. And he did a video. He referenced the work, by the way, in this video of Barnor Hesse. And I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Ben Shapiro pronounced his name Hess. It's spelled H-E-S-S-E. I suspect it's intended to be pronounced Hesse. I could be incorrect. My apologies to Professor Hesse if I have mispronounced his name. But Ben Shapiro breaks down and references when he's exposing this work called the 8 White Identities. He references the work of an overtly racist individual. Where is it? Christopher Rufo. And I went to his, I don't know if Ben Shapiro actually looked at Christopher Rufo's Twitter account or knew that he was referencing the work of someone who's just overtly racist. Like, look at Christopher Rufo's tweets, by the way. Craziness. But Ben Shapiro opens his video with a definition of anti-racist. And with nuance, his definition of anti-racist is almost correct. And he's exposing himself by quoting this as being a bad thing. Ben Shapiro states, and this is Ben Shapiro's definition of anti-racist. Check this. A person who wants to tear down all existing structures of power, castigating them as systemically discriminatory. That's actually a better definition of anti-racist than, because what he's doing is when he opens his video by defining anti-racist, he's drawing a distinction between someone who's not a racist and someone who's overtly anti-racist, which is a correct distinction to make. Again, he's revealing himself by pointing this out as a flaw. So let me reread Ben Shapiro's definition. First, okay, this is the way Ben Shapiro said the definition of anti-racist. A person who wants to tear down all existing structures of power, castigating them as systemically discriminatory. Now I'm going to reread it and insert 2 words, systemically white. I'm going to insert those 2 words, systemically white, into the definition to make the definition complete, okay? A person who wants to tear down all existing structures of systemically white power, castigating them as systemically discriminatory. Now, this is the horrible, horrible idea that Ben Shapiro is exposing here. And he also, toward the beginning of the video, he misconstrues what the Civil Rights Act was. He quotes it as the Civil Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, I do believe he meant to say. And but Shapiro says that the Civil Rights Act of 1965 says people ought not to be treated on the basis of group or race. They ought to be treated instead on the basis of identity. No, that was the opposite of what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was trying to accomplish. Anyhow, but the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination on the basis of identity, listing several, and I quote, race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. That is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which I digress a little when I bring up the fact that just last year there was another landmark ruling by the Supreme Court which went back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and said that discrimination on the basis of sex also includes transgender rights, that are the right to not be fired on the basis of being trans or being gay, etc. So they just elaborated on that. It's a non-discrimination. It discards identity from the public sphere, from the workplace, from access to public restrooms, etc., etc., etc. It bans discrimination on the basis of identity. It does not bring to the forefront of identity. Shapiro then references the reporting, this is what I was attempting to get to before, the reporting of one Christopher Rufo. Rufo, took issue with the chart supposedly being disseminated throughout the public schools, which categorized the, quote, 8 white identities. And I'm going to get to those in a moment. Firstly, and I wanted to bring this up, I mentioned it a moment ago, but now it's in my notes, okay? Firstly, Christopher Rufo's Twitter account seems to be dedicated to tearing down anti-racist movements and defending whiteness. So I question his status as a respectable reporter, on this issue, on this subject matter. Secondly, Ben Shapiro uncritically regurgitates his work, and that means that either he hasn't looked into Christopher Rufo or his public statements, or he has. And if he has, then I am going to then question, because if he has looked into Christopher Rufo, then he's agreeing with it, or if there's such a thing as overtly acquiescent. I don't think there is. But anyhow, so I'm questioning also Ben Shapiro's status as a good faith actor in this conversation. So I'm going to get into the 8 white identities as discussed by said bad faith actor covering the reporting of the overtly racist guy. Yeah, let's get into that. The 8 white identities by Barnor Hesse. And again, I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. But Barnor Hesse, Professor Hesse, has locked his Twitter account. So apparently, backlash from Ben Shapiro's video has, caused him to restrict access to his tweet. So I have no idea if Professor Hesse has himself addressed the issues or if he has had a public response. I don't know. I went to one of Professor Hesse's speeches at the University of British Columbia. And that video has like 100 and some thumbs down and only 34 thumbs up. So I'm guessing that likewise was backlash from Shapiro's racist people who went and found Professor Hesse and started thumbs down. They probably didn't even read that. They probably didn't even listen to the speech. I just went to the speech trying to find the introduction to Professor Hesse, hoping I'm pronouncing his name again correctly. That's why I went to the speech. But I will close, by the way, with a quote from Professor Hesse from that speech that he gave at the end of this video, which I will attempt to keep fairly short. But the 8 white identities are, and I'm starting from white supremacists because that's where Ben Shapiro started. I would have went the other way around. But it ranges from white supremacist on one far side to white abolitionist on the other end of the spectrum. But white supremacist, hold on, here we go. We have the 8 white identities pulled up. This is a download of the image as tweeted by the aforementioned racist professor. White supremacist is a clearly marked white society that preserves, names, and values white superiority. And then Ben Shapiro, he reads this, as he reads all of these, but he reads this, and he opens by saying, before reading the description, this is before he reads the description, so he states, and this is what all of American society is. That's the words of Ben Shapiro. He says, white supremacist, and then proceeds to say, and this is what all of American society is. And then he reads that description that I just read. What does that tell you about the logic and the thinking, the mindset, the predisposition of the mind of Ben Shapiro going into this? To open up by beginning with white supremacist and saying, and this is what all of America is, coyly referring to the social justice worker group, but he's trying to be coy. But it's not so coy. It's actually revealing on his part. Because he says, and this is what all of America is, coyly, with a smirk on his face, and then proceeds to read a correct description of white supremacy. Clearly marked white society that preserves, names, and values white superiority. That's white supremacy, Ben. That's white supremacy. My makeup smudged. Fuck my life. Anyhow. And so he reads that description and then says, that makes it that you're a white supremacist. Yes, Ben, it does. If you can look at that definition and protest it in any way, you're pretty white supremacist, Ben. You're obviously a white supremacist. And I don't throw around the word white supremacist, as casually as many do. But that's pretty much you're just acknowledging that you're a white supremacist. If you read that definition and feel coy about it in any way, yeah, you're a white fucking supremacist. Then on to white voyeurism, and he reads the text before comment. He says, wouldn't challenge a white supremacist, desires non-whiteness because it's interesting or pleasurable, seeks to control the consumption and appropriation of non-whiteness, I'm going to read that part again, seeks to control the consumption and appropriation of non-whiteness. Ben Shapiro doesn't get into that, by the way. Of course he does. Of course he doesn't. Fascination with culture, for example, consuming black culture without the burden of blackness. And again, Ben Shapiro, in thinking that he's being coy or cute, he goes on to describe that as being a white person who listens to rap music. Well, that's just a tiny little sliver of the pie of what's being encompassed. Again, very, very good work here by Barnor Hesse. Good description of what he labels as white voyeurism. And I'm going to read the definition again here. Wouldn't challenge a white supremacist, desires non-whiteness because it's interesting or pleasurable, seeks to control the consumption and appropriation of non-whiteness, fascination with culture, for example, consuming black culture, without the burden of blackness. We know the crowd being referred to here. At least an average mind of average intellect, certainly a progressive reader, knows what's being referred to, knows exactly the crowd of people being referred to by this described white voyeurist. But anyhow, we go on to white privilege. We've all heard the term white privilege before, and this is a subsection as categorized by Professor Hesse. White privilege, he describes as, may critique supremacy, but a deep investment in questions of fairness or equality under the normalization of whiteness and the white rule, with a sworn goal of diversity. And before I just mention Ben Shapiro again, I wanted to throw in Joe Biden, of all people, who wants to continue the destruction of black and brown bodies all over the world for oil money, while nominating as Secretary of Defense a person of color. This, seeking of diversity, while nonetheless propagating the destruction of black and brown bodies the world over. So I'm going to throw Joe Biden in there. That's my personal note on that matter. But Shapiro coyly here remarks that you are inherently privileged if you, and this has been Shapiro's words, you are inherently privileged if you believe in equality. That's Ben Shapiro trying to break down what white privilege is. If you believe in equality. So again, he's revealing himself just throughout this whole video. I don't know if I doubt he's going to take the video down. I don't think he sees the forest for the proverbial trees. I don't think he does. Like, he'd probably rewatch his own video and be like, oh, I nailed it. He's a fucking idiot. And he's celebrated, by the way, as a public intellectual. I'm gonna die. But and before going on to white benefit, which is the next category, he refers to this whole list as cultic nonsense. When, to me, when I read, without Ben Shapiro's garrulous gabble, when I read just this list here, this 8 white identities, it makes sense. It's a good breakdown of the various spectrum of where people stand in their ideas about their self-perceptions of whiteness. So I like that. I think it's good work by Barnor Hesse. And I would like to see, hopefully his Twitter account is not permanently locked. I would like to, and I may just follow him just for the heck of it, just put in a follow request just for the heck of it, just to see if he accepts it. And maybe I can see if he had any responses. And if I find that out, I can do a follow-up video, and discuss what his responses were. But in the meantime, I will close with one quote by him in one of his speeches. But onto the next category was white benefit. And white benefit is, and I quote, sympathetic to a set of issues, but only privately. And we know this crowd, too. But we know this crowd. This let me throw in, let me read it first. Sympathetic to a set of issues, but only privately, won't speak or act in solidarity publicly, because benefiting through whiteness in public. Because of benefiting through whiteness in public. And then they say in parentheses, some people of color are in this category as well. Now, before I get into that, the sympathetic to a set of issues, but only privately, or won't speak or act in solidarity publicly. I might throw in the words of one Martin Luther King, who warned us about the white moderate. He said, and I'm paraphrasing this Martin Luther King Jr. quote, when I'm quoting, this is not his words specifically, but he said that our problem is no longer the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate. And he referenced the silence and the acquiescence on the part of many people who might sit in their living rooms and nod along with the Black Lives Matter protest, but silently, and will not call out racism when they hear it or say anything, that crowd. And Ben Shapiro, again, he's looking at all of these, and he's being coy and with a smirk on his face, like he doesn't see any of this, which, again, this is so telling about Ben Shapiro, and it gets worse. As Ben Shapiro states, Ben Shapiro reading this is going, and it gets worse, it gets worse. It speaks volumes. Ben Shapiro just outs himself as an utter racist throughout this, worse and worse as it progresses, while warning us it's about to get worse. But he referred to all of this as cultic nonsense, and then we move on to white benefit. Oh, we just read the white benefit. Oh, this is the part where Shapiro mentions Candice Owens. Oh, goody. Oh, here we go. We have what we've referred to as the token black person, the Candice Owens, who is proud, by the way, to be a token black person. And there are people in every community who will sell out their own community for acceptance and for the applause of the heterosexual, the white, the normative society, and they will sell out their own communities, and they're celebrated, and they're even used. So in a way, even more dangerous are these people, who will sell, like the gay conservative, what's his name, Milo Yiannopoulos, the poster boy. This is our gay conservative here. Watch him sell out his community, and then let's applaud like he's telling the truth. You know what I mean? So, but Ben Shapiro, of course, mentions his token black person, Candice Owens, and then after mentioning Candice Owens correctly, because Candice Owens does fit in this category, Ben. She does. I hope Ben Shapiro sees this video. And part of me doesn't, because he needs to keep this video up because it's evidence. He needs to keep his video up because it's evidence. But with regard to Candice Owens, Ben Shapiro then says, actually, according to this list, Candice Owens is probably a white supremacist, or maybe just a white voyeurist. Probably a white supremacist? Oh, okay. See, you're telling on yourself again, Ben Shapiro, because he loudly applauds Candice Owens every fart, he does. And so by stating after when he introduced the subsection white supremacist at the top of this list, he said, and this is what all of American society is, telling on himself, and then going back to Candice Owens on this part of the list, says, well, Candice Owens is probably a white supremacist. I think Ben Shapiro just falls into the category white supremacist. That's argument number 2 that I'm getting at here. It's argument number 2 that Ben Shapiro is just an utter fucking white supremacist. But anyhow, we move on to the white confessional section of this. White confessional says, and I quote, oh, yeah, this is where Ben Shapiro said, it gets worse. White confessional. Some exposure of whiteness takes place, but as a way of being accountable to people of color after, and seeks validation from people of color. We know this crowd too. They placate to the black community with this form of rhetoric or another. They call out whiteness here or there, but again in a tepid fashion and in no systemic fashion. And oftentimes, like the Bill Maher crowd, might acknowledge racism itself, but not regard systemic racism or understand what systemic racism is. So he just reads that and then without further comment just says, don't worry, there's more. That's Ben Shapiro speaking after he reads, that definition of white confessional, which I'll read again. But then he goes, don't worry, there's more. Says, some exposure of whiteness takes place, but as a way of being accountable to people of color after, seeks validation from people of color. Anyhow, white critical is the 6th category. There's 8 categories, as I said. White critical, yes, takes on board critiques of whiteness and invests in exposing or marking the white regime, refuses to be complicit with the regime, whiteness speaking back to whiteness. And Ben Shapiro is starting to get a bit avid at this point. I think I'm going to link. As a matter of fact, I'm going to link to Ben Shapiro's video because you need to see it for yourself. Watch his video. I'll link in the description box. But he makes, again, no substantive remark. He thinks like it's just speaking for itself. He's not making so much remarks anymore. His voice is just getting more and more terse and coarse as he's reading each of these. But he just, without any substantive critique of this small piece of literature, he's just reading it with sneers and then jokes about, Whitey McWhiteface or Whitey McWhite or whatever the joke is. And now we go on to white traitor. Now, Ben Shapiro is irate at this point. I'm going to note that. Watch the video. It's great. Ben Shapiro is irate at this point. He says, or you could be a white traitor, and then reads white traitor. He says, actively refuses complicity, names what's going on. Intention is to subvert white authority and tell the truth at whatever cost needs them to dismantle institutions. Now we get into the structural issues. Now, in my opinion, we're just now getting to where we're telling the truth, because this is the first time, all the way down to number 7, white traitor. Number 7, this is the first mention of a substantively, what they refer to as radical. By definition, the word radical doesn't mean far left or far right. The word radical, by its actual etymological definition, just means to the root cause, what a lot of people would refer to as systemic. This is the first one that even made mentions of systemic racism, and Ben Shapiro is already irate at this point. He's already pissed. And he reads the definition of white traitor with sneers and jeers and drooling, essentially, at the mouth, and then without comment goes on to reading number 8. And again, I think these are great. This is a great breakdown, by the way, on the part of Professor Barnor Hesse. Number 8, a white abolitionist. And I don't think, and I'm going to get into Ben Shapiro's main problem as to what I think his problem is in interpreting this list in a moment. But white abolitionists changing institutions, dismantling whiteness, and not allowing whiteness to reassert itself. And he doesn't have much substantive critique on this either, other than reading it with utter contempt. He regards this whole thing as a screed, as I'll say in quotes, racist nonsense. Ben Shapiro thinks this is racist. Now we know this crowd too. We're familiar with these people. Like, you see a call out of racism, and they're racist. The people calling out racism become racists now. We know this crowd again. And again, this is Ben Shapiro outing himself. He should have just done a 10-second YouTube video and said, I'm racist and I'm Ben Shapiro. It's hilarious. Oh, then he said there should be lawsuits. Lawsuits. Like, we should sue the anti-racist people now. And this is the last thing I'm gonna mention from Ben Shapiro's own words, and I will critique him in a moment, but the last thing I'm gonna read from him is, when you start using terms like equity, this is where it goes. That's what Ben Shapiro said. When you start using terms like equity, this is where it goes. I'm gonna mostly agree with that, Ben. I'm gonna mostly agree that when you start using terms like equity, the reason I say mostly agree is because I wouldn't use the word equity, and the word equity frustrates the fuck out of me. Because the word we should be using, not by the neoliberal crowd, the more progressive term would be equality. And for the same reason that Ben is protesting the word equity. Because when Ben Shapiro mentioned equity in that YouTube video, it was to say equality of outcome. That's what anti-racism is. To be non-racist is more like equity. That's more like equity. That's okay. We're going to have a set course, and we're going to have non-racist policies. And I'm not a big fan of Pete Buttigieg on the substance or on policy matters, but Pete Buttigieg, when he was campaigning, actually made the very good point that after hundreds of years of systemic racism and overt racist policies, overtly racist policies, I should say. I'm sorry. What you need now to correct it is not just non-racist policies. After hundreds of years of racist policies, to correct the matter, you need anti-racist policies. That's the difference, in my opinion, between equity and equality. And Ben Shapiro he's protesting just the word equity. That's it. He's just protesting equity. And saying that when you start using words like equity, this is where it goes. Well, yeah, actually, yeah. What do you mean by this is where it goes? Calling out racism? Having anti-racist policies and sentiments in a society based on anti-racism? Oh, how dare we, Ben? Oh, how dare we? I think the reason that Ben Shapiro is freaking out here as he does over the word white abolitionist, is he's fundamentally misconstruing what is meant by whiteness. I think it's a fundamental nature of what is whiteness. Oh, hold on. Speaking of which, I did want to pull up Wikipedia on the matter, because what whiteness is meant in a more studious and a more nuanced conception of it is not so much, hold on, I'm pulling it up. It's not so much the grammatical definition of whiteness as being of or relating to the color white or being white. That's not what whiteness is. And here I've pulled up the Wikipedia page for whiteness studies. I had it sitting there ready. I had a couple of different tabs open, so I hope the RAM on my computer isn't overheating, and I hope the video quality turns out okay. And apologizing again for sticking my face so close to the camera, but I need to read this, and I'm blind as a bat, so hold on. Whiteness studies is the study of the structures that produce white privilege, the examination of what whiteness is when analyzed as a race, a culture, and a source of systemic racism, the exploration of other social phenomena generated by the societal compositions, perceptions, and group behaviors of white people, an interdisciplinary arena of inquiry that has developed beginning in the United States, from white trash studies and critical race studies, particularly since the late 20th century. It is focused on what proponents describe as the cultural, historical, or sociological aspects of people identified as white and the social construction of whiteness as an ideology tied to social status. That's what whiteness is here in this context, Ben Shapiro. That is what is being meant. Not this. Now, when you take that and misconstrue the definition of whiteness as it's meant, you start treading dark waters. You start going on a different route. When you minus the actual definition of whiteness and replace it with a simply grammatical, the of or pertaining to the state of being a white person, and then read the phrase from that mental place, read the phrase white abolitionist. That's when you start going down the dark route, and these conspiracy theorist nutbags, the white genocide crowd, is using this logic, and they're running across studies like this where people are calling out whiteness. And that's where the white genocide crowd is coming from, right? Like, they're misunderstanding what is meant by whiteness itself. It's like no one is trying to kill all the goddamned white people, Ben Shapiro. But anyhow, he's reading this in utter horror, by the way. And this is the quote by Barnor Hesse. I'm almost done here. Wow, I've gone on for 28 minutes almost. Barnor Hesse, and for the 400,000th time, I hope I'm pronouncing Professor Hesse's name correctly. I should have just said Professor Barnor just in case, right? But anyhow, quote, racism isn't as transparent an idea as we think it is. And this is the professor, this isn't Shapiro's drool. It is often rendered empirically as if it can describe self-evident conflicts, for example, between ethnic groups. Well worded. And that was Barnor Hesse opening his speech called Raceocracy at the University of British Columbia. The same speech that I mentioned earlier that has like 100 and some thumbs down and only 34 thumbs up, as no doubt from backlash from people who watched Ben Shapiro's, drooling at the mouth, and then went to go find Barnor Hesse, which is clue number 2 that that's what happened, because Professor Hesse's Twitter account is locked now. So we've activated the troll army, people. We've activated the fucking troll army. Thanks again, Ben Shapiro. You seem to be good at this. And I just wanted to close with this thought. By misconstruing what whiteness means and extricating the societal implications of power structures and inserting in its place the strictly grammatical definition of whiteness as being of, or like I said, of or relating to the state of being white, Shapiro employs the same addled logic of the acrimonious white genocide crowd and is treading very dark waters. Ben Shapiro has lost his mind. And again, my name is Devin Jones. I will include links in the description box to the aforementioned material. I'll try to remember the Wikipedia page as well. I'll definitely include a link to Ben Shapiro's craziness. You've got to see it. You've got to watch it. Anyhow, this has been the Sparx Tribune Report. Have a nice day.